Councillor Gary Grawford represents Ward 36, Scarborough Southwest, and is Toronto's budget chief. Councillor, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
It's budget time, and you've been busy for the last number of weeks preparing a budget that you've now handed off to the Executive Committee and then goes to full council. Give us the highlights of the 2016-17 Toronto City budget.
So what you will see coming to Executive in a couple of weeks in Council, as you said, is a budget that we and I, the Budget Committee, feel is affordable for the residents of the City of Toronto. We have proposed a 1.3% property tax increase, which we feel is very, very affordable for the residents. I mean, especially when you're looking at the economic times that we're in right now, people really can't afford, to pay a lot in property tax. So we're confident that the 1.3%, of course, is the rate of inflation that Mayor Tory had campaigned on, and the majority of the citizens in the city had voted in the mayor to support that. So we have been able to achieve that, which has been a very positive thing. But in the budget, when you start looking at the details of the over $11 billion budget, there are a number of sort of enhancements that really, the priorities that the city wants and that we really have heard from the residents, things like poverty reduction. We've spent almost $75 million on poverty reduction. We're looking at the arts. We're looking at the vulnerable and transit. So there are a number of, over $30 million of new and enhanced services that we've been able to achieve. At the same time, of course, bringing in a very affordable budget for the residents of the city. So I'm quite confident that this is something that Executive will absolutely support, and Council will, and it'll be something I think the residents will be looking forward to.
Councillor, one of the issues that a lot of people have said is that we have deteriorating infrastructure. And we saw this a couple of years when we had the ice storm and the flooding that occurred as a result of that. And so infrastructure is aging in the city, and I saw a graph that showed the infrastructure deficit that we're facing is over $20 billion. How is the city addressing that shortfall? And
you're right. Yeah, I mean, it's the iceberg kind of scenario of $23 billion. We are at this point spending over $3 billion a year in infrastructure across the city. A big portion of that, of course, is the TTC. And ensuring that we have a viable service. But you're right, there are a number of things that we do need in what they're called like the below the line kind of funding. We need to look at that. We put a consistent amount in every year, but ultimately we need to continue doing more. And we have so what we do is we have a 10-year capital plan that sort of addresses the needs. And over that 10 years, we spend upwards of over $30 billion. It's a lot of money in trying to maintain and grow the city we have. But there are those items, large ticket items. First of all, you will have the TTC, of course. You'll have items like the Gardener, which is well over $1 billion, and Toronto Community Housing, the backlog in Toronto Community Housing, which is upwards of over $2 billion. So these are items that we attempt to tackle every year. We never seem to get to that point. We do have a $23 billion problem that we have to address. And that is something coming out of the 2016 budget process. You will see us having more conversations. The city manager will be bringing a long-term fiscal strategy to the city.
Both the province and the feds are doing their budget programming.
Yeah.
And I know that the federal government has, the new Prime Minister has indicated that he wants to make infrastructure investments a top priority. Premier Wynne has already allocated over $100 billion over the next 10 years for infrastructure and $30 billion in transit. How are you working with both the federal and provincial governments in trying to access that funds to help restore our infrastructure?
I mean, first off, very, very closely. I mean, I think we have to have very strong relationships with both provincial and federal. And we have in the past, when we're looking at some of the infrastructure that's been happening with the Metrolinks and the Eglinton Crosstown and now the Scarborough Subway. So we've had those commitments. Having that 1/3 partnership is absolutely critical for the city to move forward. And we've had some very positive response in previous previous governments. And you're right, we do have a new Liberal government that has already indicated that, number one, Toronto is a priority and that they're looking at putting infrastructure money in. So what we're doing now is working with them. There'll be a number of initiatives that they've already indicated. They'd love to see some shovel-ready initiatives that they want to start to pay for. And we are working with them to sort of identify which projects there are. And of course, on the provincial side, working on that kind of commitment. Because at the end of the day, it is about that one-third, one-third, one-third. And we are going to be living up to the commitments. And at this point, the indication is that the federal government will be living up to the commitments. But again, there are a number of priorities when we're looking at, I think what we've already identified, transportation, TTC is a priority, but I think social housing. When you're looking at social housing and the over $2 billion deficit that we have, and I know when the mayor met with the Prime Minister, that was very much one of the bigger talking points. So I'm hoping out of those conversations that we'll see some direction on specifically the social housing in this city, because it is to a point where it's dire. It's almost to the point where we're going to have to be closing thousands of houses because we can't fix them.
Let me touch on that, because a report was just released a few days ago on the issue of the Toronto Community Housing Corporation, panel led by Senator Art Eggleton, former mayor of the city, and he basically made two recommendations: either to stay in the business or to get out of it. Basically, is the way I saw it, as what he was suggesting. And you're right, the TCHC is the second largest landlord in North America, only behind New York City, and with something close to 70,000 homes under its mandate. $1 billion plus in backlog that needs to be addressed. How are we going to deal with that?
Well, again, I think when you're looking at the task force and the recommendations have come out, I think there's a strong first step in trying to recognize, and we have had historically with Toronto Community Housing some problems in the past, and we've attempted to reorganize, attempted to sort of fix out where the problem was, and unfortunately it hasn't been successful in the past. So I'm hoping out of this task force, when you're looking at those the recommendations, that we can finally get to a point where we're kind of going, yes, this makes sense, I think this is the direction we need to go, and start really looking at that. Because when you and the problem is when you're looking at 1 year turns into 2 years, turns into 5 years sometimes, and nothing gets done. And we have had task force in the past that have made recommendations, but it's the follow-up on them. So I'm hoping that out of this process, those recommendations, once we follow up with them, will be adhered to. And from what I've been seeing so far, just looking at them, seem to be very positive.
So it raises a question as to whether there should be privatization. There's unlocked assets that the city has in TCHC that it could put out onto the market. But it also touches on something that happened earlier, late last year, and that is talk about selling off part of Toronto Hydro. And so is the city going to be looking at selling off some of its assets in order to make the budget?
Well, again, when you're looking off selling assets to make a budget, I don't think that is the most productive way to sort of manage a city fiscally. I do recognize that we need to look at all options. The city manager has indicated that. So as part of his long-term strategy that I'd mentioned previously, will be coming to the city. So what that will include was pretty much everything I think you will see on the table. He has suggested that we need, as a city, we need to look at what kind of city do we want, what kind of city do we want to aspire to be. Once we've made that decision of where we want to go, it's how do we get there? How do we start funding that? So it's a bit different than saying we have a problem, we have to sort of work up towards it. Let's sort of look at what our priorities are. And I think you will see out of that conversation, again, when you're looking at some of the indicators of Mayor Tory putting the equivalent of a 0.5% levy in the city building fund, looking at the option of revenue tools, which has always been a difficult discussion at the City of Toronto, depending on where you lie in that. But I think we need to look at that and have more of a wholesome, full discussion. I think that's the sort of commitment, as opposed to doing the one-offs of should we be raising taxes, should we be finding a parking tax here and there. Let's look at a whole slate of opportunities to look at where we need to get, and that $23 billion is part of that. So how do we tackle that with a proper sort of direction? I think that you will see probably in the next 6 months, again, as we get out of the 2016 budget. This is a long-term impact. You know, understanding that we're looking at some of the revenue tools that they sound very easy. Number one, we need to get the permission from the provincial government on a number of them. And some of these, whether it's a parking tax, whether it's a hotel tax, or some sort of levy, usually take 2 to 3 years to implement. So this is a sort of a longer term process we need to look at, but I think this council really needs to have that discussion, I think, in the next 6 months.
Councillor, thank you so much. Councillor Gary Crawford is the Budget Chief for the City of Toronto. We'll be back with The Point.